Jake Miller fixed a bike for free, and 12 hours later, 7 black SUVs were parked outside his home. Engines idling. No logos. No lights. Just quiet authority sitting in his driveway as the sun came up. Jake stood behind his front door, barefoot on cold tile, heart thudding so loudly he was sure his neighbors could hear it. He didn't know if he was about to be arrested or erased. His phone buzzed in his hand. One unread message from his boss, sent at 2:14 a.m. "Don't come in tomorrow. We're done." No explanation. No warning. Just that. And the part no one talks about is why his boss fired him so fast. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos, because stories like this don't end the way you expect. Here's what makes this uncomfortable. 12 hours earlier, Jake's biggest problem was grease under his fingernails and whether he'd make rent on time. He was a 42-year-old bicycle mechanic in a quiet Ohio suburb, divorced, one teenage daughter, the kind of man people described as steady because nothing dramatic ever happened to him. That Tuesday evening, just before closing, a woman stood outside the shop holding a kid's bike with one bent wheel and a chain that wouldn't catch. She kept apologizing, voice thin with embarrassment, explaining she didn't have money until Friday. Jake looked at the bike, then at the way her hands shook as she spoke, and said, "It's fine. I've got it." He stayed 30 minutes late, straightened the rim, oiled the chain, and waved off her thanks. As she left, she said something that stuck with him. "You have no idea what this means to us." At the time, Jake didn't think about it again. Would you have? The next morning, those SUVs changed everything. Men in plain clothes eventually knocked. Calm, polite, federal. They asked Jake to step outside. One of them glanced at the house, then at Jake's hands, as if memorizing him. Inside, his daughter was still asleep, unaware that her father's quiet life was being peeled open. Jake kept replaying the bike repair in his head, trying to connect it to what was happening now. It made no sense. At the station, he wasn't charged. He wasn't even accused. Instead, he was asked questions that felt sideways. Had he noticed anything unusual about the woman? Did she say where she lived? Did she mention a name? Jake answered honestly. He didn't know. He hadn't asked. He just fixed a bike. When they let him go, no apology followed. Just a warning to remain available. And that's when the second shock landed. His boss, a man he'd worked under for 9 years, wouldn't return his calls. By noon, Jake's shop access was revoked. Fired. No severance. No explanation. How would that make you feel? To understand why this spiraled so quickly, you have to go back 6 weeks earlier, before the bike, before the SUVs, before Jake's name appeared in a database he didn't know existed. The shop he worked for had recently signed a quiet contract with a logistics company tied to government supply chains. Nothing illegal, nothing flashy, but enough to put the business under light federal attention. Jake didn't know that either. All he knew was bikes. What the investigators later confirmed was this. The woman with the bike was connected to an ongoing fraud case involving stolen identities and cash drop-offs. The bike wasn't the crime. It was the timing. Jake was the last documented interaction before she disappeared. From the outside, that made him a question mark. And in environments like that, question marks get isolated fast. His boss panicked. Fired Jake to protect the contract. To create distance. No loyalty. No conversation. Just fear. Imagine being discarded not for something you did wrong, but because someone else was scared. 3 days later, the truth surfaced in a way Jake didn't expect. An investigator returned, not with handcuffs, but with a quiet explanation. The woman had been found. Alive. She had used the bike to reach a shelter across town after leaving an abusive situation tied to the fraud ring. Fixing the bike hadn't helped a criminal escape. It helped someone get away. Jake was cleared in minutes. No record. No charges. Just a verbal "you're good." But life didn't rewind. His job was gone. His reputation bruised by silence and rumor. That night, sitting at his kitchen table, Jake felt something heavier than fear. Anger mixed with clarity. He realized how fragile his place in the system had always been. One kind act had nearly cost him everything, not because it was wrong, but because it was inconvenient. Would you still help a stranger if you knew how fast the ground could shift under you? 2 months later, Jake opened a small repair stand out of his garage. Word spread quietly. Parents, kids, neighbors who remembered small kindnesses. The woman with the bike never returned, but one day a handwritten note arrived with no return address. It read, "You gave me more than a ride. You gave me time." Jake folded it carefully and kept it in a drawer. not as proof, as perspective, because this story isn't really about SUVs or investigators or a lost job. It's about how close any ordinary life is to consequences we never see coming, and how our choices echo in ways we don't control. As you think about Jake, ask yourself this. If doing the right thing put you at risk, would you still do it? And if someone helped you once, without asking anything back, would you remember them the way this story asks you to remember him? Jake Miller was 42 years old, and if you passed him on the street, you wouldn't remember his face 5 minutes later. He was ASE certified, not because he loved certificates, but because passing meant a small raise and fewer questions from management. He spoke softly, kept his head down, and fixed things the same careful way every single day. Bikes, brakes, chains, gears. Problems that made sense. He lived in a rented duplex with thinning carpet that always smelled faintly of old oil and laundry soap. Every other weekend, his teenage daughter stayed over, and those weekends mattered more to him than anything else. He stocked her favorite cereal even when money was tight, and he always pretended not to notice how quickly she was growing away from him. Jake wasn't ambitious. He just wanted stability, a predictable schedule, rent paid on time, no surprises. And for years, invisibility felt like protection. After the divorce, Jake learned how expensive quiet survival could be. Child support left little room for mistakes, and his savings account rarely climbed above 3 digits. He didn't complain, because complaining didn't change numbers. Instead, he memorized routines. Up at 5:30 a.m. coffee brewed for exactly 4 minutes. Same route to work. Same radio station, low volume. At the shop, he was the guy who filled in when someone called out sick, the guy customers trusted without knowing his name. His boss praised him in private and ignored him in meetings. Jake accepted that trade without resentment. Being noticed felt risky. Being steady felt safe. What Jake didn't know was that being invisible would cost him. Because when things went wrong, no one stepped forward to explain who he really was. No one said, "That doesn't sound like Jake." Silence filled the gaps, and silence has weight. The night before the SUVs arrived, Jake sat alone at his kitchen table, sorting bills into piles he already knew by heart. Electric, rent, phone. He heard the hum of the refrigerator, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog, the ordinary sounds that told him nothing bad was happening. When his daughter texted him about a school project, he smiled without realizing it. This was his life. Small, contained, manageable. He didn't post online. He didn't argue politics. He didn't take risks. So when his boss's message came hours later, short, cold, final, it felt unreal, like it was meant for someone else. Jake reread it again and again, trying to find a reason hidden between the words. There wasn't one. How would you process losing your livelihood overnight, without warning, without explanation, when you've done everything right? When people later asked Jake what scared him most that morning, he didn't say the SUVs. He said it was the waiting, standing there while strangers decided who he was based on fragments. He realized how little evidence a quiet life leaves behind. No advocates, no record of decency, just absence. In those hours, he thought about every choice he'd made to stay small, to avoid conflict, to be agreeable. He wondered if stability had been an illusion all along, something granted temporarily, not earned permanently. And as the questions came, measured, calm, procedural, Jake felt something shift. Not panic, awareness. The understanding that systems don't see people, they see patterns. And people like Jake only matter when they interrupt those patterns. So ask yourself this as the story moves forward. If your life were reduced to paperwork and assumptions, would anyone know who you really are? Or would you disappear the way Jake almost did? The shop where Jake worked wasn't the kind of place you grew attached to. It was corporate-owned, branded in neutral colors, designed to look the same whether you were in Ohio or Arizona. Flat-rate labor ruled everything. You were paid for what the system said a job should take, not how long it actually took, which meant rushing was rewarded and patience quietly punished. Cameras watched every bay, every register, every corner where a favor might happen. There was a printed policy taped inside the break room door, no freebies, no exceptions. Jake had read it dozens of times. He also knew which rules were enforced loudly, and which ones were enforced later, when it mattered. The shop smelled like rubber and coolant and burnt coffee, a smell Jake associated with security because it meant another shift completed without incident. Rick, the manager, fit perfectly into that environment. Early 50s, clean shoes, crisp shirts that never seemed to wrinkle. He spoke in calm, reassuring sentences, always framed around words like efficiency and liability. Rick didn't raise his voice. He smiled while enforcing rules, the kind of smile that made you feel unreasonable for questioning him. In meetings, he talked about protecting the business, protecting jobs, protecting futures, as if those things were fragile objects only he could hold safely. When someone made a mistake, Rick didn't embarrass them. He documented it. Quietly. Thoroughly. Jake had once overheard Rick say, "Problems don't need drama. They need distance." At the time, it sounded professional. Later, it sounded like a warning. Rick didn't fire people loudly. He fired them cleanly. Jake's relationship with Rick was polite, distant, and functional. Rick trusted Jake because Jake never argued and never slowed the numbers. But trust in that building was conditional, measured weekly, sometimes daily. Jake had seen coworkers disappear between shifts. One week they were there. The next week their locker was empty, their name removed from the schedule without ceremony. No explanations were given. Rumors filled the gaps, and Rick never corrected them. That silence did part of the work for him. Jake understood this, which is why the bike mattered more than it seemed. Fixing it for free wasn't rebellion. It was muscle memory from a time before policies had fine print. But cameras don't understand context. And Rick didn't need intent, only risk. Ask yourself this. If kindness violates policy, who decides when kindness becomes a problem? It was late afternoon when she arrived, the slow part of the day when the shop felt tired instead of busy. Jake noticed her before anyone else because she didn't step inside right away. She stood just beyond the doorway, one foot resting on the concrete, holding a rusted bicycle like it might fall apart if she let go. The frame was scratched down to bare metal in places, the rear wheel bent inward at an angle that made Jake's jaw tighten. Her hands shook as she pushed the bike forward, not from age alone, but from effort, maybe nerves. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and careful, like she was afraid of asking the wrong thing. "I just need it safe," she said. "I don't ride far." She opened her palm and counted exact bills, smoothing each one as if they might disappear. Jake smelled rain on her coat, the kind that lingers after a long walk. He didn't know her name. He didn't ask. Something told him not to rush this moment. Jake crouched beside the bike and did what he always did first. He checked the brakes. The cable snapped back loose in his hand, frayed nearly through. Dangerous. The kind of thing that fails without warning. He imagined a sudden stop sign, a car edging forward, a child darting into the street. Fixing it properly would take parts, time, and money she clearly didn't have. He looked up at her and saw her watching his face, searching for a verdict. She braced herself slightly, like she already knew the answer would hurt. Jake thought about the policy taped in the break room. He thought about the cameras above his head, blinking quietly. He also thought about his daughter riding to school, trusting that the bike beneath her would stop when she needed it to. "How much do you have?" he asked. She told him. It wasn't enough. Not even close. She nodded as if she'd expected that, fingers curling inward to hide the bills. Jake didn't know someone else was listening. He told her to wait by the bench and rolled the bike into his bay. The shop noises swallowed them both. Air compressors hissed. A radio murmured somewhere. Jake worked slower than usual, deliberate. He replaced the cable with one he'd bought himself weeks earlier and kept in his toolbox, just in case. He straightened the wheel as much as he could without new spokes, wiped his hands on a rag already stained beyond saving, and tested the brake twice. Solid. Reliable. When he wheeled the bike back, she stood up too fast, worry flashing across her face. "I know it's not much," she started, but Jake shook his head. "It's fine," he said, the words coming easier than he expected. Her shoulders dropped, relief visible in a way that felt too intimate for strangers. She whispered, "Thank you," once, then again, like repetition might make it real. As she left, she glanced back, eyes lingering on Jake as if trying to memorize him. Somewhere above them, a camera recorded everything, silently, without context, without mercy. And none of them knew yet how far that moment would travel. Jake stood alone in his bay after she left, the shop noise returning to normal as if nothing had happened. 12 minutes. That was all it took. 12 minutes to choose between policy and conscience, between cameras and kindness, between a job that barely covered rent and a line he didn't want to cross back over. He told himself it was small. A spare part here. A cable he already owned. No invoice. No record. He washed his hands longer than usual, scrubbing grease from his nails while his mind replayed the steps he'd taken, searching for the moment he could undo. But there wasn't one. The decision had been made quietly, without speeches or heroics. Just a man fixing a problem in front of him because he knew what would happen if he didn't. Jake had seen enough accidents to understand that neglect doesn't announce itself. It just waits. Ask yourself honestly, in that moment, with a camera above your head and bills waiting at home, what would you have done? When he handed the bike back, he kept his voice practical, almost detached, like that would protect them both. Just don't ride at night, he said, tapping the brake gently. And tighten this once a week. He demonstrated once, slow and clear. She nodded, committing every word to memory. Then she looked at him in a way that made him uncomfortable, not because it was grateful, but because it was personal. Thank you, she said. A pause. You remind me of my husband. The words landed heavier than Jake expected. He didn't ask where her husband was. He didn't need to. The way she said it told him enough. He smiled politely, stepped back, and watched her leave, the bell on the door chiming softly behind her. That sentence would matter later, though Jake had no way of knowing that yet. For the rest of the shift, Jake felt exposed. Every glance toward the ceiling made him aware of the cameras. Every footstep behind him made him tense. He imagined Rick reviewing footage, pausing it, zooming in, counting minutes the way other people counted money. Jake finished his work, clocked out on time, and drove home with the radio off, listening instead to the hum of the road and the faint rattle of his aging car. He told himself he'd done the right thing, but right doesn't always feel reassuring. Sometimes it just feels permanent. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Jake wondered when kindness started needing permission and why decency felt like something you had to hide. And if you've ever made a choice you couldn't take back, even when it felt right, you know the quiet weight that follows you long after the moment has passed. The next morning, Rick asked Jake to step into the office. No raised voices, no tension in the air, just the low hum of a computer and the faint smell of fresh coffee. On the monitor behind Rick's desk, footage was paused. Jake recognized the angle immediately. His bay, his hands on the bike. The timestamp sat in the corner like a quiet accusation. Rick didn't look at the screen at first. He folded his hands, leaned back slightly, and spoke in the same calm tone he used for scheduling issues and safety reminders. He explained policy, liability, precedent, words that sounded reasonable when arranged carefully. He never once asked why Jake did it. That part didn't matter. There was no anger in his face, which somehow made it worse. Anger could have been argued with. This was just procedure. Rick finally turned the screen toward Jake, as if offering transparency. He smiled, almost apologetically. You're a good man, he said, pausing just long enough for it to register. Then he added, good men don't keep businesses open. The sentence settled between them, heavy and final. Jake felt heat rise in his chest, not rage, but embarrassment, like he'd misunderstood the rules of a game everyone else knew how to play. He thought about explaining, about saying the brakes were dangerous, about saying someone could have been hurt. But explanations are only useful when someone wants them. Rick slid a folder across the desk. Termination. Effective immediately. Access revoked. Final paycheck processed. No appeal mentioned. Jake nodded because there was nothing else to do. He cleaned out his locker during lunch, when the shop was loud enough to swallow the sound of his leaving. Tools clinked into a cardboard box, each one carrying a memory of long days and quiet competence. No one looked up. No one said goodbye. Not because they didn't care, but because caring had consequences. Jake taped the box shut, signed out, and walked past the bays one last time. He didn't slam a door. He didn't look back. Jake didn't argue. He just nodded. That night, sleep never really arrived. Jake lay on his back, staring at the ceiling fan as it cut slow circles through the dark. Every sound felt louder than it should have been. The refrigerator cycling on. A car passing somewhere down the street. The soft tick of the wall clock marking time he couldn't afford to waste. Rent was due in 8 days. His daughter's birthday was 2 weeks away, and he'd already promised her a used keyboard she'd been practicing on at school. His phone sat face down on the nightstand, untouched, like it might deliver bad news just by lighting up. He thought about calling someone, anyone, but the list in his head felt shorter than it used to. Unemployment forms, resumes, interviews where he'd have to explain why he left his last job without sounding defensive. Jake didn't regret fixing the bike, but regret doesn't pay rent. He replayed the moment in Rick's office again and again, searching for the version where he said something different, where he stood up for himself without sounding naive. But every version ended the same way. Paperwork. Silence. A box of tools in the passenger seat. Around 3 a.m., he got up and stood by the window, watching the streetlights glow on empty pavement. He wondered if the woman was safe. He wondered if she ever rode at night. He wondered if she knew what it cost him. The questions didn't comfort him, but they kept him company. As dawn began to thin the darkness, Jake finally sat back down on the edge of the bed, exhausted without having slept. And then morning came. Morning light barely made it through the blinds when Jake heard the engines. Low, steady, more than one. He stood at the window and pulled the slat down just enough to see his driveway filled with black SUVs, parked in a neat line like they'd practiced it. Doors opened in sequence. Shoes crunched on gravel with calm purpose. No sirens. No shouting. Just movement. Jake's stomach dropped. His mind raced through explanations, each one worse than the last. A lawsuit from the shop. A theft accusation over the spare parts. Corporate retaliation for breaking policy. He felt suddenly foolish for thinking this would end quietly. He grabbed his phone, then set it back down, unsure who he would even call. 7 SUVs don't come for thank yous. Across the street, a curtain twitched. Someone lifted a phone. Jake could already imagine how this would look later, stripped of context and shared in fragments. He slipped on shoes, hands unsteady, and opened the door before they could knock. The air smelled like cold exhaust and damp grass. One of the men greeted him by name. Another scanned the house behind him, eyes sharp but unreadable. Jake nodded, the habit of compliance kicking in when fear took over. He listened as they asked him to come with them. Just to talk, they said. Just to clear something up. He locked the door behind him without knowing when he'd unlock it again. As he stepped off the porch, he realized something unsettling. Whatever was about to happen had already been decided somewhere far away, by people who would never know his face. One of the men stepped forward, calm and unhurried, introducing himself not as law enforcement, but as legal counsel. His tone was polite, almost reassuring, the kind that suggested order rather than threat. Jake felt a brief flicker of confusion. This wasn't matching the fear he'd been carrying since dawn. The man explained they weren't there to detain him. They were there to clarify an event that had taken place the previous evening. As he spoke, a door opened on the far SUV. Slowly, deliberately, the woman stepped out. The same coat, the same careful posture, the same eyes. For a second, Jake wondered if exhaustion was finally catching up to him. Then she looked directly at him, recognition softening her face. This wasn't coincidence. This was design. They explained it piece by piece, not rushing, as if Jake deserved the courtesy of understanding. She wasn't just a customer. She was a major shareholder, a silent partner in the parent company that owned the shop, the widow of the founder, known within certain circles for showing up unannounced, anonymously, to observe how operations treated people when no one thought it mattered. The bike hadn't been a trap. It hadn't been staged for punishment. It was a real problem she needed solved. And she had chosen not to disclose who she was because disclosure changes behavior. She looked at Jake then and said the words quietly, without accusation or praise. I wasn't testing the shop, she said. I was testing the people. The weight of that sentence settled into the driveway, heavier than the SUVs ever were. She explained that the cameras had done exactly what they were meant to do. They showed policy compliance. What they didn't show was judgment. That part only appeared when someone had something to lose. Jake listened, stunned, as she described watching the footage herself, not for violations, but for pauses, hesitation, care. She saw him notice the brake cable. She saw him look up at the ceiling. She saw him decide anyway. When she learned he'd been fired before anyone asked why, something broke that couldn't be ignored. Rick's efficiency reports were immaculate, his numbers flawless. But numbers don't explain why good workers vanish. She thanked Jake for being honest when no reward was guaranteed. Then she told him the visit wasn't about punishment. It was about correction. As Jake stood there, neighbors still watching from behind glass, he realized the moment that cost him everything had also preserved something harder to replace. His sense of who he was. And if you were standing where Jake stood, hearing that truth after a night of fear, would you feel relief first, or anger at how close you came to losing it all? She spoke quietly as the SUVs idled behind them, not in a tone of triumph, but observation. She rode bikes herself, she explained, despite a recent hip surgery that left her balance fragile and her mobility limited. Over the years, she had learned that people treat vulnerability differently, some with indifference, some with impatience. She often went into shops, carrying her own cash, counting it carefully, recording how mechanics and staff responded when they assumed she was powerless, when they assumed she wouldn't notice the shortcuts or errors. Most ignored her, some even dismissed her entirely. But Jake had done something different. He noticed the danger in the bike. He acted, not for recognition, not to be rewarded. He acted simply because it needed to be done. He shielded her from embarrassment without hesitation. He treated her as a person, not a transaction. She watched, quietly, as every ordinary moment revealed extraordinary character. The consequences of that morning were real, but measured. Jake didn't get his job back immediately. He didn't walk away with money, promotions, or accolades. Instead, his quiet courage prompted change. The corporate office conducted an audit. Rick was removed quietly, his name scrubbed from leadership emails and reports. The policies that once punished kindness were rewritten, clearer, with allowances for discretion when safety or decency mattered. Jake went home that night not richer, not famous, but with something far harder to quantify: integrity confirmed. And as he drove past the empty shop bays, he thought about how small actions can ripple far beyond your understanding. Sometimes justice isn't flashy or instantaneous. Sometimes it's simply the world adjusting quietly to recognize what's right. Weeks later, Jake received a formal offer. Not a lottery win, not a mansion delivered overnight. A lead technician role at a new branch, with profit sharing tied to the team's performance, and the opportunity to head a training program for new mechanics. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't life-altering in headlines. But it was trust. It was responsibility. It was a chance to build stability on his own terms. When he read the contract, he hesitated. He flipped the pages slowly, weighing the numbers, the expectations, the promise. Then he asked the first question, not about pay, not about title, but about health insurance. That told her everything she needed to know. Prudence mattered. Security mattered. He wasn't taking a handout. He was choosing a future he could manage. And that's when she knew she had chosen right. Not because he performed perfectly, but because he thought first of the people who depended on him. And if you've ever wondered how a simple act of decency can return in unexpected ways, Jake's quiet reflection shows that reward isn't always immediate. It's measured, deliberate, and built to last. Months later, Jake was back at work, this time in a space that felt different, not corporate cold, not measured by numbers alone. He knelt beside a small, wobbly bicycle, hands steady as he adjusted the brakes and twisted the handlebars just so. The kid beside him watched, wide-eyed, trust absolute. Across the bay, she stood quietly, the woman from that morning months ago, observing without interrupting, letting the moment exist for what it was. Jake didn't look up, didn't need approval. He just did the work carefully, intentionally, with the kind of patience only someone who's lived through fear and consequence can muster. Jake didn't win because he was lucky. He won because he was decent when no one was watching. And that's what matters most. So ask yourself, would you have done what Jake did, knowing it might cost you everything? Pause for a moment and think about that. If this story stayed with you, like the video and subscribe for stories that remind us character still matters.